it's time for another agricultural revolution that prioritizes building soil health.
Indeed, de-risk the farmers' challenge, because they need to do this, they need to dare to make the step.
So it was a case of relearning everything that we hadn't learned and forgetting a lot of the stuff that we had learned.
So welcome everybody to the first episode of a new series about food. But it's not just about food, it's about the question of how are we going to feed a growing population, now nearly 8 billion people on this planet, with healthy, nutritious and sufficient food, while also simultaneously dealing with some of these huge emergencies the world is facing right now, from climate change to the loss of species to also the degradation of our land. We're going to look at this issue, these challenges, but also the opportunities through the lens of regenerative agriculture. And in this first episode, we're going to look at what is regenerative agriculture, what could it potentially do to deal with these challenges, what can it also do to help farmers with sustainable livelihoods, and also how we scale it up over time. I hope you're going to be excited about this. A lot of people are talking about regenerative agriculture, companies, NGOs, scientists, and also farmers. It's a hot topic. As we look to the next UN climate conference, which is taking place in just a few days in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we know that around perhaps a quarter or more of the pollution that's causing climate change is coming from the way that we produce food. So again, we have to address this issue. We also know that species of wildlife are also plunging at quite alarming rates, according to the latest assessment. Something like nearly 60% of wildlife populations have been going down, and this also has to be dealt with. And when you look at land degradation, you're seeing, according to the UN, something like 40% of the world's land is degraded or damaged, threatening maybe half of humanity, and also maybe $44 trillion worth of the world's income and wealth. So, before we start and introduce the three terrific guests that we have on this show, I'd like to ask the viewers to download the We Don't Have Time app. And then if you do that at wedon'thavetime.org, you can engage with the guests on this show, post questions, hopefully get answers. And you'll also be able to engage with a family of now 80,000 organizations, individuals and institutions around the world who are part of We Don't Have Time, generating something like 80 million in social engagement. I'd like now to also thank Unilever, who are supporting this show. And I'm very delighted, before I introduce our guests, to introduce Hanneke Faber. Well, is it Faber or Faber, Hanneke? You tell me.
Faber is perfect.
Faber is perfect, okay. I was thinking about the book publishers, Faber and Faber, but anyway. And Hanneke is president of Unilever's Nutrition Business Group, and she's very passionate about a positive systems change in food and agriculture through the lens of regenerative agriculture. I would also say, by the way, that Hanneke was on a previous show of ours, was talking about regenerative agriculture, and in fact that inspired us all together to think maybe we should have a series about it and illuminate it to more people. It's very exciting. Hanneke, briefly tell us a little bit about what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and it's great to be here. For Unilever, regenerative agriculture is really, really important. So I'm looking forward to this show where we have some real experts, people who are doing it, people who have studied it, people who are funding it. I'm looking forward to hearing more about what they know about scaling it, because I think that is probably our biggest challenge at Unilever. We are a very large global food business, about 20 billion euros in sales. 3 billion people use our foods products every day, so they eat our stuff every day. Brands like Knorr, like Hellmann's, like Marmite, like Magnum, like Ben & Jerry's. Those brands rely on agricultural materials, soybeans, tomatoes, onions, you name it. We want to farm those more regeneratively. We have started to do that with farmers around the world, but I want to scale it fast because we don't have time. So that's really what I'm looking forward here too. How do we mainstream this? How do we go faster? Because honestly, we need it to save the planet.
Exactly. Good. All right, Hanneke, stay with us. We're going to now go to our first guest, and our first guest is Nicola Renison, who likes to be called Nick. I'm Nicholas. I like to be called Nick as well. We could have a whole show about that, but we don't have time. She farms with her husband, Reno, in Cumbria, which is in the north of England, and we thought it was very appropriate because, of course, the last UN climate conference was held in the UK in Glasgow, COP26. You're the daughter of dairy farmers, Nick. You and your husband now farm, I think, around 80 beef cattle who are 100% grass-fed. You've got laying hens that follow the cows around in an eggmobile. I know I'm desperate to ask what an eggmobile is, but maybe I have to resist the temptation. And you've got some woodland pigs as well. So, and you're also the founding members of Carbon Calling, which is a regenerative farming conference in the north of England. Nick, try and tell the viewers here, why did you move from what you might call intensive agriculture, which was what you were doing, I think, just over a decade ago, to regenerative agriculture? How did this journey begin? And if you could touch on a little bit of what are you actually seeing in terms of your land, in terms of your business, in terms of maybe the biodiversity around you in the north of England. I'm very interested. I'm actually from the north of England. So, Nick, I'm going to ask you to come in here and give us your perspective. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so I farm in the north of England with my husband, Reno. And when we first got to our own farm, the reason why we turned into the regenerative system, and at that point we didn't even know about the word regenerative. It was purely for financial reasons. We moved to our farm with a big mortgage, and when I looked at our cash flows, to farm conventionally, we were going to survive, but it was going to be quite a meagre living. So the first reason why we turned on this path was purely financial. And that was our light bulb moment was going to see some farmers on the northeast of England who were organic, farming at scale, very mixed farm, and they had everything in a rotation. So it was, I don't know if you've talked about rotational grazing, but it's a system of grazing which mimics nature. So everything is moving all the time around the farm. So and also the crazy thing was, Reno and I had both been to college, and we didn't actually know how grass grew. We went to conventional college, and when we we didn't know how grass grew. So it was a case of relearning everything that we hadn't learned and getting a lot of the stuff that we had learned. And then that was in about 2013. And from then, it's a word that's used very often. It's a bit of a cringe word, but it's been a journey. So we started with rotational grazing, and then we started reading books. We had David's book, Gabe Brown, became obsessed by an American farmer called Joel Salatin from West Virginia, and a chap called Richard Perkins from Sweden, and we just totally relearned everything. And now we have a very mixed farm, and we stack enterprises, and it's made farming enjoyable, opposed to a chore. And I think when you're brought up in the conventional farming system, I'm 46, and there's like a shifting baselines of what's normal. So I spoke to a farmer who was in his late 80s a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about having butterflies everywhere, where I've never seen butterflies everywhere. So the whole nature thing is something that we're missing, and we don't know we're missing it. So we're now getting lots more wild on the farm, and it's quite exciting seeing the changes.
Mm-hmm. And what do people say around you, right? Do they say, those crazy people around the corner, they're doing something called regenerative agriculture? and I mean, do you get people asking, or do you get people coming on the farm and saying, tell us what you're up to, right? This is really interesting.
Well, we do have lots of farm visits, and we're always very, the part of the regenerative thing is that it's a very open kind of sharing community, I suppose. But locally, I think people think we're slightly odd. And that's where, as Hanneke said before, for the movement to flourish, it needs to, the danger is that our farm becomes a little nature oasis, and we're producing great food. But if that just happens on our farm and we're surrounded by set stocking and hardcore grazing. It isn't the shift. It's too slow. So as your program says, we don't have time.
Nick, I'm fascinated by the fact that you said, your number one reason to go regenerative was financial. Can you say more about that? And has that panned out in the almost 10 years that you've done it?
Well, it's just been a huge, it's been very successful, as particularly now when fertilizer input cost is so high. I think nitrogen fertilizer over here at the minute is about £850 a tonne. And we just stopped using any inputs, fertilizer, chemicals, and our only inputs are feed for the pigs and for the chickens, and we feed soya-free, palm oil-free grain to them. So it's just been a huge advantage to us, and it's got much bigger and even more than we expected. Yeah.
Amazing. And your yields are competitive?
David will maybe talk about this later, but I think when we stopped, we went very cold turkey on the inputs. So we had 3 years of a dip, which was quite hard to work through, but we stuck to the plan. And then now I would say we're probably 90% where we were before, which is absolutely fine. Yeah, but I think that's the area that needs support when people are going through the transition.
Yeah.
Good. Super. Let's now move to our next guest, which is David, or Dave as he likes to be called. People here like to be called different things to their official title. So we've got Nicola, who's Nick, and we've got David, who's Dave. He's a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington in Seattle in the United States. Dave is passionate about the importance of soil as a key to healthy crops, healthy farming, and healthy people. His award-winning books have become a beacon for millions of people around the globe, trying to transform food systems from a problem to a solution that humanity urgently needs. These include In Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, and Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. And his latest book, which he's done with his wife, who's a biologist, called Anne Bickley, I hope that's right, is called What Your Food Ate, How to Health Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. Dave, welcome to the show. Could you tell us, what is regenerative agriculture from your perspective, and why is respecting the soil absolutely key to restoring healthy food production on our planet? Dave, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Well, I would consider regenerative agriculture to be the types of agriculture that actually build and enhance and maintain the fertility and health of the soil as a consequence of intensive farming. And I sort of came to that sort of opinion of what the future of agriculture should be like by looking at the past, because I'm a geologist by training. And if you look back at the last 10,000 years of agricultural history, a story emerges of one that can be summarized fairly succinctly, that societies that don't take care of their land don't last, and their descendants pay the bill. There's a long history of soil degradation, both soil erosion and loss of soil organic matter, degradation of soil fertility on the lands that we depend on to raise our food. There's a lot of degraded land around the world today, and we simply can't afford, because we, as you say, we don't have time to basically not learn the past civilizations. We've got to figure out a different way to farm so that we don't continue degrading land. The basic problem can be basically boiled down to thinking about soil not so much as dirt, like we've tended to think about it, or as something to hold our crops up, but think about it as a living ecosystem. Because if you go back and look at the relationship between life in the soil and plants, these are complex, symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationships and a web of ecology, every bit as complex and intriguing as what we know above ground when we think of like pollinators and flowers, for example. We can see those with our own senses. We can study them. A lot of the action that matters in connecting soil health to agriculture is happening below ground in the microbial world, which makes it hard for us to actually see because it's happening in the hidden half of nature that is smaller than we can detect with our senses and below ground, sort of a twofer in terms of not being able to appreciate it all that directly without technology. But in the last 80 years or so, sort of on the same kind of time scale that what we now consider conventional agriculture has become conventional, we've also opened up new dimensions of how to understand the soil. And the role of soil life in building soil health has really become crystal clear. And the connections between the health, the way we farm, the health of the soil, the health of our crops, the health of our livestock, and human health have gradually become more and more clear as the sort of little dots got connected on individual studies. And that's what Anna, my recent book, What Your Food Ate, really goes into, is how to sort of connect those dots with the science that we've um, pulled together over the last half century or so. So, what has been the real sort of problem in terms of conventional agriculture and soil health? It's the overuse of nitrogen fertilizers. It's the degradation of soil organic matter through the overuse of nitrogen fertilizers, but also through intensive tillage, the mechanization and disruption of the soil from tillage that alters communities of soil life, changes the ecology of the soil in ways that were only recently started to become more in focus and understood in terms of what that means for the agricultural choices we made in developing the era of modern agrochemical dominated agriculture. And it turns out that inadvertently, in prioritizing the high yields above all else, we undermine the connections between the health of the soil and how things that we need in our bodies get into our crops. Things like micronutrients, vitamins, and mineral elements, for example. Things like phytochemicals that plants produce greatly in response to stimulation from beneficial soil life that has suffered under the modern conventional agricultural practices of intensive tillage, fertilizers, and agrochemicals. And those things in our bodies, the latter, the phytochemicals, chemicals that plants make, are things that we may know of more in the health literature as antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, things that actually were not necessary for survival the way calories are. And I'm not saying we shouldn't prioritize growing enough food to feed people. Calories are obviously important. But we need to reprioritize also the quality of food in the same time as we prioritize growing quantities of food. And why? Because the things like phytochemicals and micronutrients actually help us maintain our health and help with, you can consider them as elements of preventive medicine, things that help us thrive and not just survive. And it turns out that soil life and its connections with our crops and with our livestock as well actually influence how the things that get into our bodies via our food system, that whole sort of linked set of connections. And what regenerative practices do in farming, whether in terms of growing crops or in livestock and meat and dairy products, is that they prioritize soil building practices that put soil health first and essentially prioritize that chain of causality that allows health to ripple up from the soil into our agricultural products and into our bodies. And that's basically a way to it allows a way to farm using fewer inputs, like Nick was talking about, in the sense that if we basically ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity, so minimize tillage, and maximize the use of cover crops and having living plants in the soil at all times that are exuding compounds into the soil that are things like carbohydrates, like fats, like proteins, food that helps to feed the microbial world, which will go out and prospect for things like mineral micronutrients and interact with chemical signaling with our crops to stimulate them to produce phytochemicals. That's how we basically can better grow more nutrient dense food. And so we've neglected those connections in our designing our modern agricultural system. And it has had consequences that were unforeseen at the time, but that we can now recognize in hindsight. And it's time really for a course correction to think about how to rethink that. And adopting those regenerative practices in terms of cropping that I just mentioned, of no-till cover crops and diversity, are sort of an important foundation for rebuilding soil health. And you can look at styles of animal agriculture, the rotational grazing that Nick mentioned earlier, as one that can really accelerate soil building as well. So the commonality really in regenerative agriculture is putting the health of the soil first. And that is essentially what we cover in the new book and how that connects that on to human health. but there's a host of benefits that can come from rebuilding healthy, fertile soils around the world. And those include the reduced need for nitrogen fertilizers and the obvious cost savings to farmers for that, the reduced use of diesel as well by going to no-till practices, and the reduced need for pesticides and other agrochemicals. And what are some of the big expenses on modern conventional farms? Well, fertilizer, diesel, and pesticides. And so that those cost savings that can accrue from that can actually really help the bottom line on farms. And the farms that I've visited around the world that have gone through the transition from conventional to regenerative practices are pretty generally more profitable than their conventional neighbors. And as Nick mentioned, there can be a transition period that I also found was on the order of about a few years, 2 to 5 years, 3 years roughly on average, wherein if you go cold turkey, if you have a field that's been worked conventionally for 100 years or so, and all of a sudden you deprive it of nitrogen fertilizers, your yields are going to go down. But they can come back up remarkably fast. And as a geologist by training, it's something that can be turned around in a couple years. To me, is almost like snapping your fingers. But that's not the way if it's your farm, and it's not the way if it's your livelihood. So a big challenge for regenerative agriculture is figuring out how to assist farmers through that transition so that they can become profitable once again as they get through converting to practices that'll be sustainable, better for the land, better for our crops, better for our livestock, better for ourselves, and better for our planet. Regenerative practices can also increase the amount of soil organic matter in the soil, and that translates into more carbon in the soil. Carbon is essentially the fuel that drives the subterranean ecosystem that enhances nutrient cycling and does all those neat things I was talking about earlier. But carbon is also one of those things that we need less of in the atmosphere and more in the soil. And regenerative farming can do that. Now, regenerative farming, I don't think it's not going to solve the climate crisis through sequestering carbon, but it can certainly help a lot, both by reducing agricultural emissions and also by parking carbon in the ground where it turns into an asset instead of a liability. And so the degree to which that can help with the climate crisis is something we ought to be taking absolutely full advantage of everywhere that we can. And it can also, regenerative practices can enhance on-farm biodiversity particularly in terms of pollinators and insect predators, the things that eat pests, and birds. And that's a crisis globally. The decline of insect and bird abundance globally is absolutely shocking. And regenerative agriculture can help turn that around if adopted widely. So, as
Okay,
I
I'm
look
going to
at
rush you a little bit here now, but if you want to just wrap up these remarks here, and we can also discuss this a lot in our second half. So, yeah.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. I mean, we're at the point in our collective agricultural history where, in order to be able to sustainably produce the kinds of high yields of nutrient-dense crops that it will take to feed the world in a post-oil economy, if we get it through this century, it's time for another agricultural revolution that prioritizes building soil health. And that's what I view regenerative agriculture as opening the door towards. It's a very significant step in human history that we really need to accelerate.
Hanneke, do you want to make a quick comment on what Dave was saying?
Yeah, I love actually that last comment, Dave. Another agricultural revolution. It is that big if we are to scale it fast. So love that framing. You also mentioned, challenges in funding the transition. Have you seen good examples of funding the transition for farmers?
I would say I've seen mixed bags. I mean, most of the farmers that I've interviewed who were early adopters adopted for similar reasons that Nick mentioned earlier, financial ones. They ran out of money to buy fertilizer. They were in hard times and they had to figure out a different way to do things. And so economic hardship was a prime motivator for many of the early adopters, but that doesn't have to be for more recent adopters. If we in terms of accelerating the transition and getting more farmers to go regenerative over the short term, ways to essentially subsidize the transition or to provide risk mitigation for that transition, I think could help go a long way towards encouraging more farmers to do it. Nobody wants to take a chance, risk the farm on something their crazy neighbors are doing. But on the other hand, if you can basically reduce the risk from it, maybe people will start trying it. And what I've seen as a very effective strategy for many farmers is to start trying regenerative practices on a field or a corner of one's farm. And then as they figure out how to do it and become comfortable with it, most of them, if they stick with it, will expand and see success with it. But you can think in terms of agricultural policies and subsidies being restructured so as to encourage and enable farmers to make the transition. We're currently subsidizing farmers in the Western world to destroy our land, and we need to subsidize them. The only rational long-term social policy is to subsidize them to enhance its fertility.
Absolutely. And are you pleased with the announcements of the U.S. government recently, basically on the new farm bill and new subsidies?
It's a good first step, yes.
Great.
Good. So let us go to our last guest, which is Marco de Boer. He's the CEO of Renature, which is headquartered in the Netherlands, which he co-founded with the Brazilian Felipe Vilela. Vilela, is that correct? I kept looking at different ways of saying that, but as long as somebody nods their head, I feel so comfortable. Marco, you've had a distinguished career in advertising and business, and Felipe is the child of a 60-year-old family business in large-scale organic farming for citrus production in Sao Paulo, or near Sao Paulo in Brazil. And you met at something called the Thought for Food Summit in 2017. I assume this was clearly something of a Damascus moment for you and for Felipe. Since then, you've dedicated yourselves to an innovative cultivation system that is circular, linked with regenerative agroforestry, mimics nature's ecosystems. And the vision is to make this mainstream. You're now working with brands like Unilever and Danone and LVMH, which I looked up. Seems to be a champagne company, which was something to celebrate, I suppose. And you're working in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and you're working with experts, and you're trying to make it happen. Can you tell us a little bit, Marco, why you started this journey? Because you moved from one area of the world of, say, advertising and business into regenerative agriculture. That's a big step in the first place. And can you tell us a bit about the benefits that you're seeing among farmers in the projects that you're supporting around the world?
Yes, I can. Thank you anyway, Brad, for inviting me. When I met Felipe, I was as said, 25 years in the industry, in the advertising industry. I helped and served all the bad brands, so to say, even the oil and the darker brands as such. And when I met Felipe, I heard his story on agroforestry. And I asked him right away, why is nobody doing this? It makes so much sense to use the nature as a system to create and produce food. And then I dived into it a bit, and I discovered that back then is only 4 years ago, the farmers that were practicing this were really all on little islands. They were practicing their own little things and improving their systems, but there was no real outside communication. So I told Felipe, maybe if we can make this actually big, if we approach it as the new solution. So with my knowledge of branding and positioning, and when Felipe proposed to me, I said, yes, let's do this. And we started Renature first as a foundation, and now it's a for-profit and a foundation together, helping thousands of farmers. And for me, why I do this is that regenerative practices do not only ensure nature conservation, and it transforms the depleted land into fertile soil, which also provide new and more sustainable livelihood opportunities. So with the farmers that we help, they do have less costs on the input side. They're less dependent on external factors. They really create a system that works with nature. And it increases biodiversity, it improves the water quality and the quantity, it sequesters more carbon, and it increases the soil fertility. And so it's really, it's just the only way to go, in my opinion.
So tell us where you're working or where you're operating. I looked at your website. There seem to be projects in Chile, in Brazil. Is it 15 projects in total so far that you've established over the last, say, 4 years? Give us a flavor of some of these different kinds of agricultural systems you're supporting.
Yeah. No, no, we are the 15 that you found are the active projects that we run right now at this moment. Renature is headquartered in Amsterdam, so we create a methodology, and the project managers here at the office, they manage the local experts and the local project managers. So we do not fly that much. It's really meant to have a system where we use the local capacity and the local knowledge to push Regen Ag to make sure that we do, because we don't speak Swahili, we don't know Swahili, we don't feel Swahili. So it's really meant to have those local people doing the local work. So the only thing that we do is that we have a methodology, like make sure that you know what's happening in the field. So we have questionnaires for that. Based on that, we design a system, we get it implemented, and as said by Dave, we don't change or transform the whole field. You cannot ask a farmer to jump into a pool without teaching him how to swim. So we really make a model farm, a small corner, 1 to 5 hectare. If it's a large farm, like in Brazil, the farms are like a smallholder farm, it's like 200 hectares or more. So there we have a bit more bigger model farms. But basically, we create an example, they have the trial and error phase, and then they can scale up.
Good. Hanneke, do you want to come back on that? Maybe not in Swahili, but in...
Thank you, Nick. That's kind. That wouldn't go well. I think your point, Marco, on local is so critical. It also makes it, like for a company like ours, it sometimes feels a bit overwhelming, because if I look at the number of, crop, country, region combinations I have, it's an overwhelming number. But going local is key. So can you say a little bit more about how you make sure that, you really get the right systems in place for every region in the world and every crop and the combination of that?
Yeah, well, the key here is not to look at the challenge as a Western challenge. So we really look at it as a local opportunity to change. So with the local experts working through us, like we really help them and also ask the right questions that they might not see themselves. Like if I'm going to produce in a regenerative system, you produce multiple crops at the same time. Some are for fodder and some are for rotation and stuff. If you have a coffee farmer, he doesn't know what to do with the other produce. So what we do is we help them to sell it to the market, either local market or to the big brands. So we combine the Unilevers and the Danones in one field. So if you have, for instance, tomato and cotton, they grow really well together. Unilever is not interested in cotton, but PVH is. So we actually combine them, making sure that the farmer sells, or the region, because most of the time it's not one single farmer, it's a full region that we serve. Like some of our projects run 1,000 farmers at the same time.
Yeah, super. I'll tell you one story. So our biggest program that's been in place for more than 3 years is soybeans in Iowa in the United States. So those go into Hellmann's mayonnaise. That's a very large brand. It needs a lot of soybeans. And soybeans have all the problems that David mentioned, very mechanized way of farming, so a lot of soil deterioration. So we started actually more than 5 years ago with a handful of farmers. We now have 400 farmers in the program. It's 10% of all the soybeans in Iowa are in our program, regeneratively farmed. We're seeing really strong results on soil health, on emissions, on water. So the program's working, and we've invested in that program. But what I find so interesting is the farmers really only trust each other to learn from each other. So one of our best partners there has been an organization called the Practical Farmers of Iowa, who have really helped us to connect farmers to each other, to go see a field where something is being tried, to host open days for farmers to come see. that's helped us scale. And, I'd be really interested both in Marco, but also in Nick on, how do we create more practical farmers of Iowa around the world? Because again, soybeans in Iowa is just one of the many, many, many crop region combinations that I need to convert.
Yeah. Oh, it's really important to work with ambassadors, people that really want that do the things and they speak their word. One of the criteria that we use is that we ask the farmer to select a part of his land that has visibility, either at the side of the road, in front of the factory, close to the village, so people can see it. They can really see and feel and experience the transition. And this is based because when I was traveling in the year that we were thinking about starting Renature, I had the opportunity to visit Lycopia. It's now one of our projects. Back then it was a permaculture farm, and there was a fence, dividing the rural land of Kenya and the permaculture farm. And one side was completely green, and the other side was completely brown. So for me, this was the reason why we decided to create these model farms, because seeing is believing. It's a farmer. And the funny thing is, maybe you, Hanneke, you might know, but my name is de Boer, which means I am the farmer. So seeing this instantly made me believe that this is the way to go.
Yeah.
I think this is really interesting, and I think that we're going very gently into really the second half of the show, which is diving a little bit more deeply into this with our three wonderful guests and with Hanneke as well. And I think one thing, Hanneke, I mean, I wonder whether you could just maybe ask Dave one question just to get things rolling here, because this issue of below ground biodiversity, which he touched upon, is absolutely fascinating, because I don't think people understand that. But also, I think Marco has something to add to this as well, called bioacoustics. So I'll just leave it there, Hanneke, but could maybe just get Dave fired up on below ground biodiversity, because I think we want to learn a bit more about that.
Yeah, you can, if you think about sort of a healthy community of people as an analogy, they're not all going to be the same. They're not all going to have the same job. I mean, we are, by having different jobs or a position on a sports team, you have different positions and you can play a game better. It's the same with life below ground. Diversity of life adds functionality and resilience to communities of life in the soil. They can do more together than they can do as individual species. So one of the characteristics of healthy, fertile soil is a greater soil biodiversity, and that can greater crop diversity can translate into greater underground biodiversity because of the linkages and connections between plants and the microbes that they partner with, feed, support, and derive benefit from. So, it's most of us aren't trained to think about below ground biodiversity, but it turns out to be very important for getting some of the elements that we need to get out of rocks, the kind of thing I was trained to study, and into our bodies where we want them. It's life that facilitates that transition, and different forms of life do different key bits along the chain along the way and interact with each other. So below ground biodiversity is as important as above ground biodiversity, and if we rebuild and enhance below ground biodiversity, it can support the resilience of above ground biodiversity as well. They're connected.
Marco, just briefly, I just have to deal with this. What is bioacoustics? How are you using it? And yeah, just give us a quick glimpse into that, because this is monitoring the health of the farm and below ground and above ground, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. What you make sound? It's noisy out there, basically. What bioacoustics does we listen to nature, have it go through a system where they recognize the bird species, the species, and the insects, because every single living animal has its own sound. The good thing about birds and insects and bats is that they also have their own eating pattern. So by knowing who makes a living out of flying around, can actually show you what the species below. Like, is it a grain? Is it a bird that passes by on a seasonal thing? If like there's a falcon that only wants to feed a certain region where there's enough food, So knowing that this falcon actually makes this a recognizable sign, you know that there's enough food for this falcon. So by monitoring the sound of nature, you can actually say this nature has a stamp of high value, because the pyramid of the food system is complete. This is why we do this, because then you can show that the regenerative farming does add to the biodiversity.
And you can just hear that on farms. When I go to conventional farms across the U.S., they're pretty quiet, and then you can go to the neighboring regenerative farm, and it sounds like a jungle.
Yeah, it's so true. But let me tell you, it was hard for me to convince my teams. We talk about KPIs because we're investing in the transition with farmers, so we need KPIs. So it's hectares, of course, covered. It's water use, it's yields. And then for biodiversity, the proposed KPI was bird song. And everyone was like, really? Bird song? But it's really, really important. And it can tell you a lot about biodiversity and the health of the soil on that farm.
Could we maybe touch a little bit? I'm interested in this issue of de-risking, right? How we actually de-risk this transition, because it's clear, look, I think we're all kind of now fans of regenerative agriculture. I'm a fan. I now know a bit more about it than I did before, and hopefully the audience does. But de-risking, whether it be renewable energy or whether it be something else, particularly in developing countries, but also in developed countries, whose job is it to de-risk a transition, right? Because this is going to be a big issue at the UN climate conference taking place this year in Egypt. Who's going to shoulder that transition? Traditionally, it used to be the World Bank, right, in the developing countries. In the UK, would be the Department of Agriculture, I presume, Nick. Somebody has to take that step, don't they, to make it easier for farmers to move forward. Any thoughts? Hanneke, you may have some thoughts on this as well, because you're an expert, not just a moderator.
Yeah, but I'd love to hear from Nick, because Nick, you said, you've got many other farmers coming to see you, but they don't always adopt your practices. So to de-risk it for them, who can help?
Well,
any thoughts?
I think it's some of it comes from government and policy, but lots of it comes from people like you, because it's if companies farmers work with make the move, then farmers gain confidence. But I think on a bigger scale, it's the public, and I think if farmers know there's a demand, they're very flexible. They can be very flexible if they know there's a definite market. So if the public were asking for more nutrient dense food, that would then start the motion going in a different direction. But yeah, it's a change in mindset, and my only worry is when big companies get involved is that farmers change for the wrong reasons. The whole thing with regenerative, I think, is it's a grassroots movement, and you've got to really believe, and that can be a journey in belief, but you've got to believe in what you're doing. It's like in this country, lots of farmers went organic in the early 2000s, and they were paid big money to go organic, but lots of them went back to normal farming, conventional farming, because they took the payment and then it didn't really work for them. They weren't sold on it. They didn't want to kind of stick to the journey, and they went back to normal. So I think we've got to, it's hearts and minds as well with farmers.
Yeah. And how do we win those hearts and minds best?
I think it's telling the truth about food, and it's relating food to health. Because 64% of people in the UK are either overweight or obese. That's huge. And then the NHS, our National Health Service, has to mop up all of that. So it's a vicious circle that we're just making worse and worse and worse all the time. So, when you look at my kids today were eating a pot noodle, like a ready-made pot noodle, and she was saying how amazing it was. And I said, well, she's on her phone all the time. I said, well, you Google the ingredients of that pot noodle. It's utter rubbish.
So we're working on that, Nick.
I think we've got to become, the public has got to really realise that food is medicine, and we're kind of being hoodwinked into eating. Most of our diet is utter rubbish. In the UK, we eat more processed food than I think anyone else in Europe.
Yeah.
What any thoughts on that, Mark and Dave, or who's going to de-risk this? I mean, you're working in developing countries, right, as well, Marco? I mean,
Yeah.
Dave, you're in the US, but I know you're global in a sense. You must be communicating with farmers and experts all over the world. Is it just the companies that need to do it, or should the governments be doing something in the international multilateral development banks? They all are supposed to have a job, right, to actually de-risk investments, particularly in poorer countries.
Well, the supply chain challenge. So not just the consumer that demands for healthier food. It's the chain that had to work here. Like big companies working together, as I mentioned, with the cotton and the tomato harvest, is making sure that there's money to indeed de-risk farmers' challenge, because they need to do this. They need to dare to make the step. So insurance companies have a role there. Policymakers have a role. Like in the Netherlands, it's really hard to plant trees. Why? Because if you have too many trees on your acre, then it's a forest, and the forest value ground is lower than agricultural ground. So if you create a forest, then the value of your land goes down. So all these little things has to change on small scale, local scale, regional scale, global scale. So it's not just the consumer, it's not just the big companies, it's really the whole system has to be aware that we have to change.
Yeah, there's really sort of four elements that need to come together, and one is essentially having large companies interested in promoting regenerative practices is a good thing. Having governments actually interested in leveling the playing field so that the subsidies for conventional agriculture are reduced. That's the flip side of trying to mitigate the risk for adopting regenerative practices. Every farmer I talk to in the US who is a successful regenerative farmer has said that if we just eliminated all agricultural subsidies in the US, regenerative farming would be the norm within 5 years. Why? Because it's without the subsidies, it's more cost effective and more profitable. So there's not just making the transition viable for going regenerative, but it's rethinking our overall frame and schema for essentially subsidizing and encouraging agriculture. You know, I'm a big fan of subsidizing farms. We all need to eat. But what we should be doing with our farm subsidies is subsidizing the style of farming that can heal the land and promote human health. And as Nick was mentioning, the idea of thinking about food as a component of preventive medicine is actually a really important thing. And that's where regenerative agriculture can also help by enhancing the nutritional value of what's in, or the nutritional complement of what's in our food in terms of antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, omega-3s, fats in meat and dairy, things that actually help quell inflammation that is at the root of the modern epidemic of chronic diseases. We've become very good, until the recent pandemic, that is, at controlling infectious diseases. What's really gone through the roof since the dawn of the advent of conventional agriculture are chronic diseases. And in What's Your Food Aid, our new book, we basically try and trace some of those connections and the science that connects those dots. So if we start thinking about agricultural policy as health policy, and thinking about how much we can save as societies down the road in terms of reduced healthcare costs, which are just eating up the budgets of the westernized world, that is actually, you know, a conversation we should be having. And then, of course, the fourth element, the third element, I skipped that one, is essentially farmers learning from each other how to do this and seeing that it's profitable in a world where nitrogen fertilizer in particular has gone through the roof. I have yet to meet a farmer who's really thrilled about their fertilizer bill at the moment. And if you also then connect the idea that if consumers want to eat healthier, more nutritious food, you know, all those things can line up. And so it's really not sort of one of those things in terms of incentivizing and the transition. It's getting them all lined up to work together. And if we could do that, I think we're poised to see a big transition in agriculture over the next couple of decades.
I just want to mention, you know, I think the subsidy is a very interesting angle because we have another series that we run with the UN Development Programme on fossil fuel subsidies, which has been a long-standing issue. Many governments have been trying to get off fossil fuel subsidies. But when you look at where fossil fuel subsidies go, of course, they go a lot as well into nitrogen fertilizer. So even when the price is attractively much lower, it's still getting, huge subsidies which work against people switching to a different kind of farming system, right? So the deal is stacked against, and there was a big attempt at the last UN climate conference to actually deal with fossil fuel subsidies, and it will come up again as an issue in Egypt, although at the current moment in time, of course, it's a bit complex with the energy prices and people worried about keeping the lights on. But, these all have to be addressed at some time. We are getting very short of time now, and Hanneke, I wondered, this first episode was about trying to inform our viewers, in a sense, what is regenerative agriculture? And I think we've covered quite a lot of that, but we've also covered a bit more. What I would say is that food is going to be a huge topic at the UN climate conference in Egypt. It wasn't such a big topic in Glasgow last year, and it was hardly a topic the year before, and not even mentioned 5 years before that. Is the issue of food and the links between climate change, wildlife, soil, all these interreactions, do you think it's coming forward now to the attention of governments worldwide?
It is coming forward, but it is very late. Even at the last COP in Glasgow, it was not on the agenda formally. It was kind of on the sidelines. So that has finally changed with COP in Egypt, but it's little and it's late. So, as we've heard here, we need big food to take a big responsibility here, and we need governance and policymakers to move a lot faster than what they've done before. And then I think what I loved from Nick is, we got to win the hearts and minds of farmers, because if they're only doing it for transition money, it may not last, and we need this to last. So thank you for that insight. I think that's very, very important.
Just on that, our local, there's quite a big university, agricultural university in the UK, and I saw one of the students the other day, and he had a jacket on which was sponsored by Bayer. So
yeah, right.
Yeah,
so
that's that is what we're against. It's entrenched from the very bottom all the way up. Yeah.
Exactly. So we need transformation. In a few days, we will have the UN climate conference coming. This is episode 1. Thank you very much for viewing it. Episode 2 will come live from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, again with my wonderful co-moderator, Hanneke from Unilever. And I hope you can tune in. It's likely to be broadcast at 7 o'clock local Egypt time. So look out for this. And there we're going to try and maybe deal with what are the blockers. I think we touched on those at the end of this show. What is blocking this transition? I read in the Financial Times that still only 15% of the world's agricultural lands are what you might call regenerative. That's just 15%. We want it to be 100%, don't we? So let's look. Is it finance? Is it policymakers? Whatever it is, we're going to try and unpack that in Sharm el-Sheikh, Hanneke and myself, with some terrific guests from the UN climate conference there. So thank you very much for today. Thank you to all my guests. Thanks to Hanneke. And see you soon. Bye.
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 Cheers.